in a nutshell, the teachings of the Kansas City prophets are deeply influenced by the message. And where you and I come from, John, we are a granddaddy in a lot of ways to the ideology. Our group was a granddaddy to the ideology that they have in multiple ways. The IHOP was started, I don't know exactly when the group itself came together, but there was at that time a man named Paul Cain, who is one of the most prominent of the Kansas City prophets. Well, Paul Cain was a right-hand man to William Branham from the early 1950s. And Paul Cain was continuing to preach in message churches through the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, John. So, the same years that Paul Cain is going to the Toronto Blessing conferences, going to the Vineyard Movement conferences, going to, doing all of his stuff with the Kansas City Prophets, the exact same years that he's doing that, Paul Cain's still coming around the message churches. I mean, I think it was the early 2000s for sure was the last time he was at Tucson Tabernacle, for example. So, we were with Paul Cain in the same years that he was launching the third wave of Pentecostalism in that sense when he was in the message. So the ideology that they have, I really think they don't know a lot of them where it came from, okay? They have a flavor of the latter rain movement that's deeply impacted by the influence of William Branham on Paul Cain. And so anyways, Bob Jones, who I believe is kind of the guy who started IHOP before Mike Bickle kind of took charge. He was also deeply influenced by latter rain with a lot of the exact same ideology. And the truth is, if you just take the name William Branham and you kind of lower him down a few notches from, maybe back him away from being Messiah, maybe come a little bit lower than Elijah, right? If you make William Branham a little less than Elijah, then our ideology is very highly compatible with what they believe at in those places, and so much of it similar. Like you take Bill Hammond, he created what do they call that? The Elijah class, or the Elijah. It's not like the Elijah school, but it's like an Elijah group of prophets, like the Elijah school of prophets. And so much of it is just so deeply based on what you find in the message, and so. Just from an ideological standpoint, I think that we very strongly relate to just the basic beliefs of the Kansas City prophets even.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm getting a lot of that, and Elijah's not the only name. One person was emailing me. There's all kinds of variations on it, like the New Malachi Ministries. I'm not going to give the names of these organizations, but they're using words like Malachi and Elijah, and essentially what they have, and actually one person, they've done their homework at this point. They've escaped and they've done their homework. But they were pointing out that this was all the manifested sons of God framework that all of these entities are built upon. So I'm getting some of that, and people are actually diving into the research, and they're getting the history, and they were aware that William Branham and the latter rain movement was sort of a grandfather to what they came from, maybe a great-grandfather to what they came from. They weren't aware that many of the doctrines were so prevalent in the latter rain movement, and so many of these new guys, they're claiming these new spiritual revelations, and as they're going to table.branham.org, which is the transcripts for William Branham, they're starting to realize, wait a minute, these guys are just copying bad theology from William Branham, and then they've taken it a step further, and they found out from our work, from the podcast and some of the research you have on your website and mine, that not only is it bad theology, there's a large amount of fiction, and we've been going through the connections to mysticism with Steve Montgomery, and they're learning that, wait a minute, this isn't even Christianity. What was this thing I came from? So I'm getting a lot of that, but I'm also getting, there are people who were either abused or were very fortunate they did not get abused because their peer group were getting abused by the situation. And I'm not going to take sides in it because for Christian organizations, all of these groups seem to be very happy to fling lawsuits. So I'm just going to say that there are some accusations, and I think everybody is aware of what's going on. If you go out to the news, you can see there are some sexual misconduct accusations that have been going around. And so I'm getting the group of the people who are looking into the history, but I'm also getting people who are starting to realize that there is a repetitive, reoccurring situation where people are being physically, sexually, spiritually abused in all of this. And I actually was on the phone. I can't give the people's name, obviously, but I was on the phone for, gosh, it was like 1 to 2 hours talking to somebody, and they were talking about it, and the thought just suddenly struck them. The biblical aspect of this is, by their fruits you will know them, and they can see this same fruit recurring and over and over and over. And, in the end, the person finally said to me, "What was this? This wasn't Christianity." He said something to that effect. "What was this? This wasn't Christianity." And we got to talking, and anyway, I think it would be good if we were to just go over a little bit about what this was for people who haven't yet done that research, because like I say, I'm getting emails from this, and I'm also getting, Charles, I don't know if you've been getting this, but in the months before this happened, I started getting contacted by people connected to the ministry, and it was very odd because they were very clearly fishing. And by that, I mean they were saying things and not giving me enough information to talk through it, and they were looking to see what I would say, probably wondering how much I already knew, and I'm not going to tell them that. So I kind of let it go. I answered very simply, and I want to say I was contacted at least, I want to say it was at least 7 to 10 times by people who are connected to this. And this is before the news broke out. So you could tell something bad was brewing. And at that point in time, I didn't want to say whether I knew or not, but I will say now that I can understand why they're contacting me.
Yeah, John, it's something else just how all this stuff unfolds. We did, a 70 episode podcast kind of on the history of the message. And hey, if you guys are in the Kansas City Prophets, the history of the message is the history of your movement, because your ideology has the same roots. Right? You are a branch of the Latter Rain movement, which is descended from the British Israelite branch of Pentecostalism. Okay, that is where your Elijah beliefs come from. It's the fusion of British Israelism into Pentecostalism from the late 1800s, and then from John Dowie to the Foursquare side is where a lot of that pooled into. The Foursquare denomination was kind of a home to the British Israelite ideology, coming up into the 40s. And then as you come into the 50s, it just all kind of got booted out of there and ended up in the Latter Rain movement, which then eventually produced the message. It produced a lot of other movements too. It produced the walk, it produced the move, it produced just quite a number of different groups besides the message. And then, of course, Paul Cain, through his influence, a lot of that was carried on into, the Kansas City Prophets.